Let's talk about what happens beyond the manual.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Beyond the Manual with me, Brian Garner from Manual Makers. Last time we talked about the relationship between how to create, publish, and manage documentation over time to keep it accurate and consistent. And today what we're going to talk about is some of the considerations for the create phase of this. It feels like this is the easiest phase, but it also has downstream ramifications. So some of the decisions that you make in the way that you create, and sometimes we do it just because it's easy, creates more troubles down the line. So we have to consider our strategy, the technology that we have, and how much governance we need to put in place. No one likes rules, but sometimes rules make sure that we're consistent, accurate, saying what we need to say, and helps to reduce some of the chaos. And sometimes governance just gets in the way. So we have to kind of take a look at each one of our situations and decide how we want to do things. So considerations for create. This I just mentioned governance. So the opposite of governance is freedom. How come I can't just create stuff anytime I want? Maybe you can. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what is the change frequency of documentation. Some policies, procedures only need to be reviewed every year. Maybe they only need minor updates. Maybe they don't need anything. Whereas things like tools for labor or food cost, scheduling, vendor lists, those kinds of things, maybe those get changed much more frequently. Then we also want to talk about the output. If something needs to be pixel perfect, like an ad, then it needs to be created in a specific format. If we've got more leeway with that in terms of words on a page and that they go to a PDF and sometimes they're on a website, then maybe we can do that slightly differently. And then we also want to talk about centralized versus distributed. Everybody wants distributed. It makes sense. The operations person knows the operations and they can open up Microsoft Word and they can write. The finance person knows the finances and they can open up a Google Doc and they can write. The sales team understands what it is they need to say. They open up a PowerPoint and they write. The challenge that comes with that is training, consistency, branding, accuracy. All of those things come into play. And then lastly, the tech used. Again, that's a pretty low entry for the create phase of this. Everybody's got Microsoft Word. Everybody's got Google Docs. All of that is pretty simple. The question, though, is who's going to maintain it? Does it need to be pixel perfect? And what does that look like further down the road when we go to publish and manage? So let's go back to freedom and governance. The big considerations there are whether the information that we're writing is regulated and whether or not it needs to be consistent over time and across units. If a policy requires a government agency to come in and take a look at it, if it affects safety or revenue or legality, then that means that it's got to be reviewed. It has to be consistent across different departments. It needs to be archived and maintained. So especially in the franchise industry, if we need to know what policy was in effect in April of 2023, we should be able to go back and do that. So there needs to be some governance for regulated topics. And if that's not true, if you don't have to regulate them, if the topic or the form or the convenience document doesn't affect legality, revenue, or safety, then maybe there's more freedom that goes along with that. And that means that you can use just about any type of word processing unit. It also means that you don't have to have it centralized, and there's not as much time between when it's created and when it gets published, because you don't have to worry about going through legal workflows. Another consideration is the change frequency. If something like an employee manual is only updated once per year, then one person can do that. They can set aside the time to take a look at it at the beginning of the school year, at the end of the fiscal year, at the beginning of the calendar year, whatever the content looks like. And they can make those adjustments. Some docs, some policies, some procedures, however, have a higher change frequency. Menus, for an example, within a restaurant. Maintenance procedures, vendor sheets, so installation guides. Those types of things can be handed to a technician, updated all the time, and then your manual, whether it be an operations manual or a knowledge base, can simply point to it. We talk about what it is and say, go here for the latest. It could be how to complete this form. Go here for the latest form. So now you've got the benefits of both governance, the evergreen, here's how to use it and where to find it, and the freedom to update and manage that document any way that you want because we pointed to it. So freedom and governance are a balance, but they're not mutually exclusive. We can have both of them. We just have to architect it that way. Another example here, another consideration is output. So again, if it's got to be an ad, if it has to look good and it has to be exactly the same, then that changes what you use to create. Adobe Illustrator, InDesign, some graphic softwares are better for doing things like schematics, for doing ads, for doing job aids that need to look pretty because they're being printed and because they're branding related. But just know that if you do that, you're trading flexibility for design. And that means that anytime you go to update something, then you will need to have the skill set and the software in order to update that. You can't simply have a graphic designer create it and then leave it to an admin person to modify. And the other thing with that is that you are now limited by space. With just words on a page, if we need to go to another page, we can. If we're high design and we're pixel perfect, then if you want to add 2 lines, you need to take out 2 other lines or rewrite things. So there are a lot more constraints once you've decided that pretty is more important than flexible. And that's okay, because if the pretty is also evergreen, then we don't have to change it very often. So again, all of these things kind of come in together, and we have to take a look at the considerations in total and not just one at a time. 2 other areas, and they're somewhat related. One is centralized versus distributed authorship, and that refers to who creates something. In distributed authorship, the idea is that we've got different disciplines that need to be documented and maintained. So that might mean a construction person, an ops person, a marketing person, and a salesperson. And the idea would be that each one of them gets to write their own documentation and be in charge of that. That's great in theory. It means that we're faster to market. It means that the information is accurate. But what it also means is that we have to set the standards in the form of a style guide, and we have to do a whole lot more training to make sure that every author does things in the same way. Otherwise, we wind up with one author who writes 12 paragraphs in Microsoft Word and another one who does 3 slides of bullet points in PowerPoint. We need the ability to remain consistent across topics. We have to have the ability to ensure that the information that's shared by different documents, whether it be an ops manual and a marketing manual and a sales form, are all in sync legally to mitigate the risk, to reduce confusion. So all of those are considerations in terms of just centralized versus distributed. Distributed seems to be faster to market, but isn't always. Centralized feels like it's more heavily governance, but also it might mean that you're leaving the writing to actual writers. Distributed means that an operations person, a salesperson, a marketing person who already has a full-time job is now expected to write. They may or may not feel comfortable with that. This may or may not take more time. There may or may not be more holes in the writing. So again, the balance between centralized and distributed, maybe there's a hybrid format in there where the subject matter experts can write, and then it comes back to a centralized format to be processed so that it's all in the same format, so that you can proofread it, so that you can publish it in the same way, and so that you can make sure that it fits all of the strategic and technological needs that are affected elsewhere. And then the last consideration for creating, we've already touched on it a little bit, is the technology that's used to create often affects decisions that you make later on in the process, whether the publishing process or the management process. So for example, if you create in Microsoft Word, because that's what you have, then the way that you publish it is to convert it to a PDF, because you don't want franchisees or users to modify anything in there. So you've taken it out of a modifiable format, put it into a picture, which is what a PDF is, and then you've published it, which is fine, but now you've limited searchability. It's possible also that you're creating conflict, and PDFs very often will then be saved to a hard drive by the user and never updated. So if your change frequency is awfully high, then there's a good chance that your users have a really old version of this document somewhere on their machine. So the technology used, usually what we do when we begin to create, because we're limited in resources, is we use what we got and we figure the rest out later. That's actually okay. But if you're going to look in terms of an entire library, if you're going to look beyond the manual that you created, just to begin your franchise or just to get started or just for training, then we need to consider some of the ramifications and maybe build for a more flexible and scalable document up front. Okay, so that's create. How does any of those decisions then affect the way that we publish or the way that we maintain and manage the information? So I've touched on it a couple of times, but let's start with governance. If we have given the freedom of just creating documentation to users, then in order to manage that information, we also need somebody who's responsible for removing documents. If I take version 1 and I do an overhaul to it and I make a version 2, who removes version 1 from the intranet? Who removes the draft version from the file share? It can be the author, but what do they do with it? Do they archive it? Is it now available for legal purposes in the future? So you need a governance workflow that goes along with that if you want to make sure that publishing is simple and maintaining over time is accurate and that it meets regulatory as well as internal needs. Change frequency is also, this really is one of the considerations that really affects both publishing and management. If you're publishing to an HTML format, to a knowledge base that is searchable, that requires a different skill set for creation. Making it in just a Word document doesn't mean that it's then portable to publish onto a website. So if you're going to publish in a searchable knowledge base, then maybe some different software is needed for the creation portion of that. The other thing then is that if you're doing a knowledge base and because software is needed, then that probably leans you a little bit more into the centralized versus distributed aspect. So you really want to keep that skill set with a centralized team who does the publishing. Well, by definition, then, that means that the subject matter expert doesn't have the speed to market that they wanted to have with a high change frequency. So again, how often something changes and whether or not that responsibility lies with a subject matter expert may determine how you create and publish the information. Last episode, we talked about create, publish, and manage, and how it's a three-legged stool and an ecosystem. So today, we went into some of the considerations for create so that we could see how that affects both publishing and management of information. In the next episode, what we're going to talk about is the technology involved in publishing. This is where we start to talk about your tech stack and how information is fragmented among users and platforms, and we just need to make sure that we get the information out there. But how that happens, again, is determined by how you created it, what your goals are, and whether or not you have the ability to manage it. Most innovations in terms of content strategy come in the form of technological solutions. Most of the chaos in content strategy comes from lack of governance. So next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about the balance between publishing and governance and the ability to manage chaos within those systems. So that's it for another episode of Beyond the Manual. Content strategy is much more than a 600-page gorilla and just a single document. It's an ecosystem. It's lots of tools for different audiences at different times and different stages of their lives. So all of that creates content chaos. Our job is to help you calm that content chaos. And next episode, we're going to do that a little bit more, one step at a time.
Beyond the Manual is a Manual Makers production. This episode was hosted by Brian Garner, directed by Chase Flacius, produced and edited by Charlotte Blow. Commentary by Lucia, the Spanish Paella. Visit manualmakers.com for more resources. If you like what we're doing, please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts.